Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to another edition of In the Clouds here on OpenShift TV. I am Chris Short, the host of most shows on here on OpenShift TV, also the executive producer. I am joined today by the one and only Cornelia Davis of Weaveworks. Cornelia, how are you today?
I am doing quite well. Thank you, Chris. How are you?
I am doing quite well as well. I'm figuring out thermodynamics here in my tiny little office this morning. So yeah, it's a warm day here in Michigan, so I can't complain.
Yeah, we had snow yesterday.
Oh, fun.
I'm sitting in Central Oregon and I'm looking outside and there's like nickel-sized snowflakes, that like
wow.
spring where it's
like
just
hail
barely
/ snow, right?
It's like barely cold enough for snow, and so as the flakes fall they kind of start to stick together and you end up with these huge snowflakes.
Nice.
Yeah, I was like, come on, Mama Earth, it's May.
Well, I will say it did snow here the first week of May, like enough to cover the ground here in Michigan. Yeah. So we are friends, obviously. We have an interaction outside of work. Would you like to tell folks what you do at Weaveworks?
Absolutely. So thanks so much for having me on today. It's always a pleasure. I am the CTO at Weaveworks. I've been here for about a year and a half. And prior to that, I was at Pivotal. And so I've spent about the last 10 years working on platforms, working on DevOps platforms, really application developer platforms. And I kind of hesitate a little bit to say application developer platforms because while we really are motivated to serve the application developer so that they can release more frequently and get value out to customers more easily, but with security and compliance and all of that stuff, it's as much of an operational role as it is kind of a pure development role. So that's why I typically like to say we serve the application teams, not the developer. And so I've been working in application developer platforms for about 10 years. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Today, we're going to be talking about the business value of GitOps, right? There's a lot of buzz around the term GitOps. There's a lot of FUD too, as well with that buzz, right? Like anything in tech, it's the inevitable. But before we dive into that, I have a very important question for you. It's something we ask everybody that joins us, including Siamak. Thank you for tuning in. I'm sure you were in a meeting, and thank you. So Siamak, please introduce yourself for everybody, if you don't mind.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for being late a little bit. It's exactly like I said. I was stuck in a meeting, was trying to drop off. My name is Siamak. I'm a product manager at Red Hat, part of the cloud platforms team. I'll look after everything CI/CD on OpenShift. That includes things like Argo CD within the GitOps space, OpenShift pipelines and Tekton within the CI ecosystem, and other related bits.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So here, I'll ask the question of both of you and we can discuss. There's no wrong answer here. Cake or pie? Is cheesecake a cake or a pie? What do you think? Siamak, do you even eat cheesecake for that matter, right? Like, I feel like there might be some dietary restrictions maybe for folks
I definitely,
out there.
But ladies first, I'll go after.
Okay, so I am going to pull a James T. Kirk here and say there is no or. There is always a way out. So first of all, why would you have to choose? Because cheesecake is so delightful. It is definitely one of my faves. And I'm a cook. And so I can tell you that I have made cheesecakes that have flour in them, and I have made cheesecakes without flour. And so one you might say is a little closer to cake, one you might say is a little closer to pie, but honestly, I don't believe in an or world, a strict or world. So I'm going to say it's and.
Nice. It's cake and pie. I like that answer a lot. Siamak, how about you?
Well, I think she gave the most politically correct answer, and I don't know how to top that. But to me, cheesecake is a postmodern pie.
Okay.
It's an artistic pie done well. But regardless, I love cheesecakes. Passion fruit cheesecake is definitely my favorite.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. That would have flour in it, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
No,
It
I
would
don't
look
know.
nice if it had. Yeah.
Nah,
Yeah, I've done guava. I've also done
Oh,
kiwi.
wow.
Oh,
oh
yeah,
wow,
all
that's
good.
Okay. Good to
Mhm.
know. All right, I got to step up my cheesecake game. So, Cornelia, let's start with you. I'm asking you specifically because Weaveworks coined the phrase GitOps. What was the genesis, right? Like, how did we get to where we are today?
Yeah. So the like many other kind of open source tools, and I'll talk a little bit about how we what that journey was. It started with us doing our own work. So Weaveworks wasn't a company that started out as the GitOps company. It's been around for quite a number of years. It kind of started out as networking for container networking. And then it moved into kind of, more squarely into the Kubernetes space and started dealing with observability. So we had a SaaS offering that we call Weave Cloud, which offered essentially Prometheus as a service. So you could register your cluster, and then you could go and get dashboards and all of that stuff and see what was going on in your Kubernetes clusters.
Nice.
And we were running that SaaS service, and we had an outage. And we were able to, like a complete outage, like total meltdown.
That's never
and
good for
we
a
were
startup.
no. But the happy story is that we were able to bring the entire system back up online in like 45 minutes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, the whole thing, the whole SaaS system, top to bottom. And our CEO, Alexis Richardson, who actually coined the term GitOps, said, "How did you do that?" And the engineers, the SREs, described that what they had done, and the whole system was built on Kubernetes and those principles, that they said, well, we have everything, we have all of our declarative configurations stored in a Git repository. And all we needed to do was we needed to point, a new infrastructure, blank infrastructure to the Git repositories, and all of our automation is convergent automation. So all we needed to do was point to a Git repository, and the automation would say, "Got it from here, thanks," and it would reestablish the system. And so here was something that we had used as an internal practice, kind of like Google using Borg and then open sourcing Kubernetes. And that was an aha moment where we said, this would likely be valuable to a lot of other people. What is the tooling that supports these practices that we just did? And that was the genesis of creating the Flux open source project, which provides some set of that convergent automation. Not all of it, but some set of that convergent automation. It basically handles delivering things from GitHub into your etcd and Kubernetes. That's to a large extent what Flux is focused on. So that's the genesis.
That's pretty crazy, and also a very common pattern too at the same time. But like the story of, hey, everything's down and just blow it away. That's amazing.
Yep.
Absolutely amazing. And here we go. We have some folks on the line here, Satyam and so forth. So feel free to ask questions, folks, if you have them about, GitOps and how to implement it and so forth, so on. How does GitOps differ from that traditional or other CI/CD models in y'all's minds, right? Like GitOps takes things a different route.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in again as well. So I think the first thing that I would say is that I'm not a big fan of CI/CD as one word, and I'm not suggesting that you used it as one word. You very likely used it as two, but CI is something that we as an industry have really kind of mastered. We've been working on it for, 15, 20 years or something like that. The tooling has matured a lot. The understanding of the practices have matured a lot. And so we've been doing CI, and then we kind of extended that a bit and said, okay, well, we'll extend that CI out to delivery. And so that's why we often hear CI/CD, is because CD is kind of, it is representative of the way that a lot of folks do it, is they kind of tack on CD as the last step in CI. What we do with GitOps is actually we start with CD. We start with the continuous delivery. We're not trying to disrupt those mature CI processes, but we start with CD, but we take it further than CD. So I like to say that GitOps is continuous delivery, so CD, and CO, continuous operations. So GitOps, remember, it's GitOps, it's not Git delivery, it's GitOps. And so it's all about linking what you're doing in Git and using Git as the interface, not for delivery, but using Git as the interface for operations. So we want to link all the way out to, hey, this thing has deployed. How is it working? Are there any adjustments that need to be made, et cetera, et cetera? So that's I think one of the first fundamental differences is that we see GitOps as CD and then beyond. And then I already hinted at some other things, which is convergence. So we are pretty adamant that GitOps is modern cloud native operations. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you have an eventually consistent system and that your automation is built in such a way that it's convergent. And I think we'll talk a lot more about what that means as we go along. But I want to give Siamak a chance to
go ahead, take a stab
chime in as well.
That piece, exactly. I wanted to say like that piece is extremely important because some of the comments that I get when I talk to like customers, and unfortunately there are not much conferences to go these days to get connected with the community in better ways. But in a conversation that come up is that well, this is we always have had our stuff in Git, so this is nothing new. Or infrastructure as code is one of the DevOps principles that has been around for a long time. So it's like, why do you treat GitOps as a new thing? But that's exactly where this flavor of CI/CD that we're talking about is different from how traditionally people have been using Git and declarative configs and infrastructure as code. That is not really sufficient that we have declared everything in a Git repo and push that to a certain environment, forget about it. That's really the main differentiator of when we talk about GitOps compared to just using Git and declarative config and ISC is that the work is not done by fire and forget, that you're constantly in this loop of monitoring the state of their application. The goal is that application keeps running and it's in the state that you expect. And not just application, like this is something that I sometimes struggle with, that GitOps quite often becomes reduced to just being a part of the CI/CD flow or application delivery, but it's really a way of operation, right? It applies to specifically Kubernetes operation a lot, and in my experience, a great majority of teams, organizations that start adopting GitOps practices, they first actually do it for cluster operations, cluster configurations, rather than delivering application. It's the platform owners that start with it. And then when they feel comfortable using that and see the value, they start thinking of how could I offer this to my dev teams now, app teams, to use the same workflow for the application. So that monitoring, that continuous operation that Cornelia was talking about, in my mind, that's really a huge differentiator compared to, yes, these are the practices that existed, but the reason that the collection of these practices have a new name is that it's a different angle of perspective in the way that these practices are used together, with an extension of the way that we used to work. So that's really a core of it for me, at least.
That's awesome. So it is kind of a paradigm shift, right? Like you have to think of things as, well, no, wait, don't touch it, it'll fix itself, right? Like,
right.
That is something that people, right? You get a page and you just kind of wait until reconciliation happens, right? Like you don't necessarily have to engage the system other than to make sure the system is doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a little like funny anecdote that this before this this mind shift sometimes comes as a funny moment to a lot of the teams and customers, that like you need to get to this understanding of, I'm not supposed to manually doing anything on the cluster anymore, right? So this doesn't come naturally. And it happens often with teams starting that they do something that they see it doesn't work. Like they do this, they make this change on the cluster, but the change is not there. Like they feel there's a bug somewhere on OpenShift or on the CLI or something is wrong. I did this, but it's not there. I do it again, it's not there. So this mindset of like there's someone in the middle that makes sure that there is no one manipulating in the middle unless that thing is in the Git repos, right? So that mindset definitely is something that is new. And even for teams that are actually actively like adopting these practices, it does take a little bit of time to come to this mindset of yes, I'm not supposed to touch the cluster directly.
Yeah, and I used a phrase earlier that I'm going to keep re-emphasizing, which is Git is the interface for operations. It's not just the place that we store our declarative infrastructure as code or anything like that. It is, in fact, the interface for operations. So, Chris, if we go back to the scenario you just painted, something's gone wrong. I get the pager and I'm tempted I want to go in and fix it. Well, what is your interface for operations? Well, it's Git. So what are you going to do in Git? Well, actually, the declarative configuration for how I want my system to look, it's still there. There's nothing for me to do in Git. Yeah. It's already there. And so it does put onus on the right kind of automation. Exactly. So it's that convergent automation in order to allow you to make Git be the interface for operations, because you're just just because something went down doesn't mean you need to change your declarative configuration. Actually, my declarative configuration was right. I just need my automation to run again.
Exactly. You just want that reconciliation loop to reoccur and put things back in its state, known good state.
Exactly. But I'm going to take your scenario and I'm going to extend it just slightly. So you get a page, something goes wrong, and you investigate and you actually find that my application, which is running in AWS US West 1, is down because US West 1 is down.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could wait for a while and it won't come back. And so if your operational, your runbook now says, well, if one region goes down, point to a different region. What is your operational task now? You've been paged. Your operational task is what? Well, remember, Git is the interface for operations. What's my operational task? I'm going to go into GitHub and I'm going to say, oh yeah, I was running in US West 1. I now want to run in US East 2. So you make a change in Git that says, actually, I want to run this in US East 2. And then the convergent automation says, oh, okay, you don't want to be in West 1 anymore. You want to go in East 2. Great, got it. Take it from here. Right. And then, so it's that scenario of, disaster recovery is one of those huge benefits of Git Ops.
Mm-hmm. That right there is like a selling point for me, right? Like,
right?
I can do DR just by changing, east to west, right?
Yep.
Or vice versa. That's pretty powerful stuff. Like, and the next question I have is like, what makes GitOps a better practice? And I say practice intentionally, but that is right there one of those reasons why. All it takes is just one commit and your application and infrastructure is getting deployed elsewhere. Off it goes. So sorry for the spamming in chat. We're hammering that out, folks. So apologies there. How does an org start its GitOps journey? And I say that because, there's lots of different ways to slice this. What are the things they have to have in place to get up and running? Siamak, yes. What do you think? Or sorry, Cornelia, either one of you.
Either one. I was making sure that I wasn't always the first one to go, but I'll go again. So we've been talking a lot about this convergence, this concept of convergence and how central it is to GitOps. And so my recommendation to people who are starting, and this doesn't preclude just about anybody, because I think we found that 90% of all enterprises are already somewhere on their Kubernetes journey, is because convergent, because the mechanisms for convergent automation are an inherent part of Kubernetes. That is a great place to start. Now, Siamak is right that we do see people who are, dealing with their clusters, adopting GitOps as well. But for somebody who really, delivering value to your end customers, so enabling those app teams, kind of the platform teams, the platform, the developers that are using the platform, is a really great place to start, because they are likely they've already got their YAML. That is their declarative configuration. They've probably created some scripts to apply that YAML, or they might be applying that YAML from within the CI system, for example, or they're doing a kubectl apply. And so linking together that, now taking that declarative configuration that they already have, and now using GitOps practices to manage it in a Git repository, to manage your folder structure, to decide who your what's the access control that you're going to layer around it, who are the people, what are the kind of approval cycles that you're going to put into Git, layering all of that around this declarative configuration, and then adding a convergent delivery mechanism like Flux or Argo CD to link that Git repository over into the Kubernetes cluster is there's very little that you have to do. You basically have to start source code controlling your YAML configurations and installing a utility or two. And then you can start to get some practice at GitOps. So I think that is a really great place to start, is with Kubernetes-based workloads, because you already have several of the ingredients in place.
Right.
I do agree with that. I think the answer is a little bit, this is one of those it depends questions as well, that there are some factors also to consider on the organization's maturity or the need for control. I think I 100% agree with Cornelia that the app teams, from the declarative aspect, they are much more ready often than platform operation teams are, because if you are on Kubernetes, you have already gone through this mindset shift, or have to really deal with everything declaratively, right? So you're past that burden. On the platform side,
operations teams, they still like their clicky interfaces, right?
Right. There are still huge love for Python scripts and Bash scripts, and there are different types of scripts, or even using declarative tools in a non-declarative manner when it comes to Ansible and Puppet and things like that. So there's a lot of tendencies to that way of working, which makes it more difficult to start with GitHub, because you really have to redo all of that and figure out a way that it can declare these kind of things. From a different perspective, I think it's easier for so this is where it becomes very specific to an organization of what they need.
Right.
From a multi-tenancy perspective, platform ops teams have less concerns, because they often own the clusters and they don't need to care much about are we authorized to make these changes through Git? Who is going to approve it? They are the ones approving it. They are the one owning it. So they have less of a concern on access control and how they have to fit that into the GitOps model. Do they have to rely on the Git provider access model, or can they? How should the Git repo structure look like if they want to reconcile the app teams with the cluster config and things like that? So there are other questions come into the picture. So depending on which side of this is stronger for a particular organization, I think they might be more inclined to in one direction or other, right? If a platform team has been extremely imperative, doesn't matter, they don't have to think about a multi-tenancy. It becomes a huge hurdle for them to be able to get on this workflow. But on the other hand, if they have been on a Kubernetes distro, or they have been already thinking themselves even declaratively, it becomes much simpler, because they have less of a hurdle on the multi-tenancy part. Or maybe now we are seeing, this is, I think actually this is one of the drivers actually, to be honest, that GitOps is taking a lot more traction over the last year, because GitOps is, again, it's not like Cornelia talk about this, that I think Weaveworks coined the word even a couple of years back. It's nothing that has just recently raised, but I see a lot of attention on it just recently. And my own interpretation of this is that this has to do also with the maturity of most organizations that are operating Kubernetes. They are having more and more of it, getting more comfortable with it. So they are coming to the day 2 challenges of having Kubernetes, that they weren't aware of these challenges yet 3 years ago, 4 years ago, in the beginning of their journey. So there are organizations that get to a level that they are giving a cluster to each application team. And for those ones, the model that Cornelia described fits perfectly, because there is no multi-tenancy concern at all. I am the owner of this cluster, and I have everything declaratively. It's a really low barrier to start with a GitOps process, combine it with my CI. So you have different potentials or different receivability in different organizations, let's say.
That's awesome. So I'm going to no, go ahead.
I wanted to circle back because you talked a little bit about, you briefly mentioned before we got onto this latest thread about, what makes GitOps better, some of these kind of business values. And that's kind of the title of our session here. I wanted to highlight another one that I think is really interesting, that really kind of dovetails 2 things together. And that is, I'm a big fan. You've seen me do talks before. I'm a big fan of the work that Dora has done. And the Dora metrics. And so what we talked about before with disaster recovery, well, the Dora metric that's tied to that is mean time to recovery. So how quickly can you recover a system? But there's another one that I'm a big fan of, which is very squarely in kind of the operation space, which is the change failure rate.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's super interesting about GitOps is that it allows you, again, going back to this notion of Git as the interface for operations, is that before we had a collaborative, really like a tool that was designed around collaboration, around change control. The way that change control typically worked was we did all of this work, and then kind of the last step before we pushed things out into production, we had this elaborate ceremony where some change control person would come along and say, okay, now you have to prove all these things. And they would have their checklist. Yep, exactly. They'd have their checklist and all of that stuff. And one of the things that we talk about, and I was just in my DevOps Enterprise Summit session earlier today, was we talk about shifting left.
Yeah.
And so what GitOps allows you to do is it allows you to shift that control, that change control left. So now you are doing these checks on, you're storing now configuration changes for your production system. You're storing those in Git. And so now you can have all of the people who have the best context as approvers in that Git repository. And you can set it up so that you have to have 3 approvers. You have to have this approver is required in these other two of the other 5, that type of thing. And so there's this notion of collaboration. So GitOps supports collaboration around change control. So broad visibility, lots of different eyeballs. It's not so checklist based, it's in context, which I think is really important.
Right.
But then there's the other part, which also lends to this lowering the change failure rate, which is, okay, we've just made a change. I'm going to roll this change out. I start rolling this change out, and on the first sign of something going wrong, before a whole bunch of my users are affected, I recognize, and I might even have automation like Flagger or something that is helping me with this progressive delivery. At the first sign of trouble, we go, oh, never mind. Let me go back to the previous version. And so those 2 things in combination, collaboration, Git-based collaboration, and the fact that I can just snap back to an earlier part in my version history, and I have a complete representation of what that looked like, so I can, go back to that state. That is a game changer for change failure rate, reducing change failure rate. So that's another just perfect example of how GitOps changes this whole DevOps scene. I mean, the State of the DevOps report has been around for longer than the term GitOps has been, but GitOps really supports the whole DevOps agenda in a really particularly compelling way.
Awesome.
That's actually what I usually point out when I talk to customers, and they have this question of they haven't been too involved in this space. If is GitOps like what comes after DevOps, or how is that like related? But this is exactly like the relationship, because so the core of DevOps is almost a cliche now that is collaboration, right? You've seen hundreds of presentations that start with this slide of collaboration, which is like useful information to have. The next questions that most customers ask is about, okay, how I do want to collaborate more, but what am I supposed to do? Is it like have weekly calls now, but with InfoSec and QE and like everyone have half an hour every week in that call, or
more meetings?
One of them in every team, or how are we gonna collaborate more? Like give me the recipe, right? This is the question. Like I think that has been one of the like challenges of DevOps that I see, that it from the value to the practice there's a big gap of how do I realize that, right? It was left a lot to imagination and interpretations, and GitOps really like gives that comes with a prescriptive process for that realizes those values, right? So this is I think that in adoption curve, most organizations in any type of like any new process, new technology, new way of working, in the beginning, most organizations are not at the maturity level that they can consume a couple of different ways of doing that and decide like actively with sufficient awareness which one fits them. It's rather they want something a lot more prescriptive and instructive of how they need to do things, and then get to the mature level that they can modify that process or change it in ways that fits them. And this is what I see as one of the really extremely important values of GitOps that makes adopting those DevOps practices extremely accessible. Like it really breaks it down into the type of like workflows that frankly most organizations already have. Like when was the last time you talked to a team that is not using Git? So a large portion of these workflows are known, and it connects certain dots for them that was not this visible. So that's how that's one of the big values that I see out of like really putting this together. And like going back to like the term, I do think that even though these practices are not new, I do see a lot of benefit in the term, thanks to Weaveworks for coining the term, because it brings attention to the packaging of these practices in a new way and how they relate to each other, how they're used together. It helps a lot with that perspective, in my opinion.
This literally takes us to our next question, and I'm going to toot my own horn here for a second because no one else will. Back in May of 2018, I was on a podcast on the New Stack. The folks over there invited me on, and I actually said, to me, GitOps is the holy grail of DevOps, right? Like, it becomes a way to force some of those DevOps practices onto an organization that might not realize that they need to, right? So GitOps is, in my opinion, an implementation of DevOps, and you can build a lot more taking that GitOps approach in your organization culturally by doing it this way. I mean, is that kind of, has cultural changes, occurred as a result of folks embracing GitOps from your perspectives?
I can start with that one. So it is, there are like varying degrees of that that they can see. Frankly, I can't say I've seen a like total shift of culture across the entire organization, but I do see, especially like talking with the same teams over like different quarters, you can see the changes and the the level of collaboration, how it increases, especially like I said, like within the enterprise the context and customers, the type of customer that Red Hat has, and we talk to very often. We do see that it comes from this control environment, and gradually they get loosened up to bring in more app teams and other teams to collaborate. So, and the type of questions that we get and type of like problems that customers have in this space does point out that the roadmap of visions that organizations are building toward how they can share the responsibilities more. How they can let go of some of the controls that a lot of these organizations have at the lower levels of infrastructure. And it's difficult for me to judge if GitOps is the reason for that, or that was the reason they adopted GitOps, but they go hand in hand a lot in many of the conversations we have with these people.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I'm not sure that GitOps has been the forcing function, and I'm right there with you, Chris. That GitOps, again, it serves the DevOps agenda particularly well, but I think that the DevOps agenda is the thing that has been forcing the cultural change more than GitOps as a practice in specific.
Absolutely.
It's become rarer and rarer. I mean, back in my earlier pivotal days, most organizations still had a very kind of traditional IT structure where they had the app developers were super siloed from, and they threw things over the wall, and there was an operations team, and the operations team wasn't operating, just infrastructure. They were operating infrastructure and the applications, despite the fact that they didn't have the context of the applications. And so that bifurcation of developers just do development, they don't do operations, and operations just does operations, they don't do development. And by the way, they do operations of the entire stack. That was still quite prevalent, I would say 6-7 years ago. Absolutely. What I'm finding now is this realization of a platform team, and Siamak earlier used platform owner. This notion of platform and platform team has become pretty darn common. Yeah. Now, I will say that there's still, Kubernetes has taken that. So you take this concept of a platform team, and there's a very closely related concept, which is self-service. Mm-hmm. Now, self-service has come through the cloud and all of these things. Right. So when we think about enterprise platform teams, what I see a lot of happening right now, and Siamak, you talked about it earlier in one of your use cases, which is the thing that they self-serve is they self-serve Kubernetes clusters. And now it's still very common for me to talk to somebody in the enterprise organization who says, yeah, but now the problem we have is that we have to beg them to make sure that they keep it all up to date. Ooh. That they update their Kubernetes versions, that they update the software, the version of Prometheus that's running on there. Mm-hmm. And so what they've done is they've self-served infrastructure, mm-hmm. essentially by giving a full Kubernetes cluster with, you talked about Siamak, no multi-tenancy there. So you can do anything you want on it. Right. Meaning you could do good things, you could do bad things.
With great power comes great responsibility. Yeah.
Great responsibility. Exactly. And so where GitOps is, it continues to support that. And it's not only, I wouldn't say that GitOps is the thing that's the forcing function, is that GitOps is, I keep emphasizing this, it is Git as the interface for operations. And Siamak, you just said it as well, which is you got to give up the fact that you're not going to get the entire cluster, but you can use GitOps to, this is something where GitOps isn't really the thing that's solving this. It's Kubernetes that is. Kubernetes allows you to apply things into the cluster at so many different layers that you can apply declarative configuration into the cluster. That's not a workload, it's a configuration of the cluster. And so the platform team could then be responsible for those configurations and GitOpsing those configurations so that they're serving to the application team the ability for them to operate their own applications, not the infrastructure itself. They're self-serving operations, not self-serving infrastructure.
Yes. That all right there is worth it to me, right? Like,
Yep.
if I'm looking at this from my business it has lots of stuff going on and there's a whole bunch going on and this team is running all Kubernetes for my entire organization, I'm going to sit there and be like, they have to be struggling because Kubernetes, the advancement of change is just rapid. And then, when people say Kubernetes, they don't just mean the upstream project Kubernetes. They mean like Kubernetes and all the bits and pieces like we ship with OpenShift, right? Like it's not just Kubernetes, it's Prometheus. It's all the bits and pieces, Fluent D, a whole 9 yards that you have to consider and think about and say, all right, like these need to be updated or updatable at any given moment due to potential vulnerabilities or whatever, organizational mandate, compliance, whatever the reason may be, which kind of dovetails kind of slightly into like, what is the audit trail like with GitOps, right? Like I always like showing people like, hey, you made all these changes. Oh, what are the auditors going to see? Like there's always that concern about letting go, like Siamak said, right? Like, what do I lose by doing this? Well, you actually gain something pretty awesome by doing GitOps. What is that audit trail like for folks? Because I feel for that poor person that's about to go through an audit and their Kubernetes cluster is like all kinds of everybody's in it kind of deal.
So, I mean, we can start with the high level marketing buzz around GitOps and auditing. We go, oh, it's easy. So this is the marketing, it's easy part, which says, hey, everything's in Git and everything's recorded in Git. It's the only interface to operations. So every single change made to your environment is, you can see who made it, who approved it, and it's in a Git repository somewhere. Okay, it's in a Git repository somewhere.
Right.
And we just talked about how the platform team has responsibilities for some layers in the system, and the application teams have responsibility for some layers in the system. And so this is an area where, yes, the data storage is there. It's the storage, all of this stuff is recorded in Git. This is something that early GitOps adopters and practitioners have then hit squarely and said, okay, well, it's all recorded in there. How on earth do my auditors navigate that? And this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for all of us to build kind of a certain set of tooling that serves the auditor well. So that allows them to, for example, see that, well, if something went wrong here, let's trace, or if something went right, let's trace what were all of the different commits that that played a role in the way that this runtime environment was operating in the end. It doesn't come from, it's not the entire thing from your cluster configuration or your cluster definition, cluster configuration, infrastructure definition, all the way up through the workload is in a single Git repository, and I can just navigate the version history there. I have to stitch these things together. And that's someplace where we still have to do a lot of innovation in the GitOps space.
I mean, Stephen Nemo here in chat just mentioned like SOX, separation of responsibility, right? Like that separation can still exist, but it can converge in a Git repo into a pull request kind of thing, right? Like that's definitely Christian Hernandez is in chat and says someone needs to write a tool that turns Git log into a report for auditors. That's a good idea.
Yep. Exactly.
There are like other sources of info as well. Like I wouldn't say that. I would say that this is definitely like provides easier access to audit than not having a trail of changes in Git. Like if you don't have that, you have much bigger problem, frankly.
Right.
But there is a gap. I agree. There is a gap that so there, like Git is a great place. Across multiple repos, perhaps is distributed. You also have. We talked about Prometheus. You also have perhaps alerts in Alert Manager. There you have Kubernetes events of the cluster that has been the target of these deployments, and there is usually a GitOps tool also in place that has also a trail of changes that is applied. So there is definitely an opportunity there for like new tooling really to appear to close this gap of correlation of data. How do you correlate all these different events that I have in different systems? So everything is documented, but how can I look at a window of time and put all this on a timeline that can help me, not just for audit purposes, to be honest, but even for like root cause analysis and reducing the like failure time, the metrics that we're talking about it. So there are, the current situation is better than like without relying on Git, but there are improvements, in my opinion, that can be made still.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk about the event you two just keynoted for a little bit. GitOpsCon was day 0 or day 1, whatever we call it now, event at KubeCon EU a couple weeks ago. What were your big takeaways from that event, right? Like there's a lot of interest and we had a lot of people speak, both of you included. What did you pick up anything along the way during that conference that you'd like to share with anyone else?
From my perspective, I go first on this one. From my perspective, like the very fact that it was so well received, even though there are, like this year, there are multiple GitOps events really in a very short time frame, close to each other. And the fact that it was so well received, such a high level of participation, and at KubeCon of any event, which is, there are a lot of different events that are really competing for attention. My conclusion was that this is definitely a challenging area for many of like people in the Kubernetes ecosystem. These are not pain points that are like unique to a small segment of organization that perhaps are further in their DevOps journey, or they have scale problems, or have multiple hundreds of like Kubernetes cluster, and they're thinking about. What it tells me that this is a very actual problem that a lot of teams with various shapes and sizes in different verticals and different maturity levels are dealing with, and they're looking at GitOps as a possible workflow that could help them address these challenges. So it has been, it was great to see, but also shows like how much more aware we need to be across these different type of use cases, and how much more conversations like we need to have with these teams or organization to understand how their cases are different, how their requirements or challenges might be different. And other flavors of this process, or other changes that might be unique to a particular vertical, for example. This is something that I took away, at least, from the event.
Nice.
Yeah, and to put a metric against some of the things that you just said, we had 900 people over the course of the day join GitOpsCon. It was
amazing,
phenomenal. When we first, put the event on, and it was an event that was co-sponsored by Weaveworks and Red Hat. When we first came up with this idea of, hey, do we do a 0-day event around GitOps and all of that stuff? I don't know about you, Chris, but I was thinking, man, if we got 200, 300, 400 people registered, that'd be pretty cool.
My thing was like 500, right? Like if you can get 500 people to show up for anything, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we smashed
we smashed it. I mean, from a registration perspective, we were up in the thousands, which I mean, for a free event, it's typical to, but even there, I think we had 2,700 registrants and 900 people showed up. So 30% is a pretty high success rate when it comes
for virtual
to,
events these days. Absolutely.
For virtual events. Yep.
To give another metric, most of those people spent more than 3 hours in the event, right? Yeah. Which is absolutely like telling about how interested people are in this space. So your teams that are working right now probably just went to GitOpsCon. They're probably going to GitOps Days in June. I dropped the links to the playlist from GitOpsCon and the link to GitOps Days. But we're also planning GitOpsCon North America for October, when KubeCon is hopefully going to occur in Los Angeles.
Yep.
we're in the works making these, virtual or hybrid events, whatever they need to be. And
yeah,
there is great interest amongst
yep.
the industry for these things.
Now, I want to plug a couple of sessions really quickly from there. So for your listeners that didn't have a chance to attend, there, of course, all the GitOps Con videos are up on, and Chris was the executive producer for that. So thank you, Chris, for providing all of your expertise in doing that. So Chris and his team have made all of those things available on YouTube. There were a couple of talks that I found really great. I'm always really drawn to the end user, so the success stories. So one in particular was Generali Switzerland, or Switzerland Generali, I think it was Generali Switzerland. And there was another, and I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the company, but I would encourage you. It was single track conference, so there's only about nine sessions or something up there. So you'll be able to easily find the ones that are connected to the practitioners, the people who are putting these practices in place and who are inventing those along with all of us in the industry, because it is in the early days. I would say that we're 5-10% of the way in on our GitOps journey at the moment. So we're still learning a lot about these practices. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to go out and take a look, especially there's a couple of really great talks.
Yeah, there really are. I mean, even the lightning talks are great. The quality of what we got submission wise in such a short amount of time was really impressive. Yep. So if you're doing GitOps out there, please, let us know, and, we'll get you signed up for a session at GitOpsCon NA or help you out with GitOps days. I want to wrap up here because our friends over on Dev Nation are about to gear up at the top of the hour. But one last closing question for both of you. What gets you up in the morning, right? Like, there's all these challenges out there, and it feels sometimes overwhelming, even for me, to help people solve them. And what motivates you to just get out of bed and get going every day?
I can perhaps start. So, I really love talking to customers and the challenge. So I'm as you know, I'm within the Kubernetes space, so I exclusively talk to most customers about issues around Kubernetes and CI/CD on Kubernetes. But one side of it is it's really rewarding when you talk to customers, understand them, and you can impact products at Red Hat in a way that addresses their challenges, not on the same day, but in a life cycle, and you can really evolve the products and offering in Red Hat in a way that helps those customers, and the consequent conversation. That's a very rewarding experience for me from the process perspective. And the other side of it is really the Kubernetes space is extremely exciting. I care passionately about developers, about development process. We talked about GitOps, and a lot of that relies on that declarative ways of working that we talked about. And Kubernetes as an ecosystem is such a live thing, and the direction that is going and the way it's growing. And I see things like the Kubernetes, the control plane that is detaching Kubernetes from that declarative everything, and growing the type of interaction with Kubernetes outside a cluster. You talk to Kubernetes as a way to drive the other type of infrastructure outside Kubernetes or services. It's becoming really the centerpiece of declarative everything, that and knowing closely how GitOps can improve operations at customers, and how that can become in a year or two when that part of the ecosystem of Kubernetes expands. And it's at the very beginning of journey, but as we grow that part of the ecosystem, I get really excited where this will be in a little while, and the type of conversation we will be having with users with Kubernetes, teams that are adopting Kubernetes, of the degrees of ways of working, the GitOps type of operation that can apply, and how this can expand to things that is not really imaginable today for most of these organizations, and even for ourselves, because we're talking very future looking. I'm extremely excited about those pieces.
Awesome. That's
Cool.
great. Thank you both for being here today. I really appreciate your
Wait,
time.
I get to answer the question
sorry.
too, don't I?
Yes, my bad.
And I promise I'll keep it short, but I do want to take just a moment before I answer that question to emphasize something that Chris said. We do have an event. Weaveworks is putting on GitOps Days. It's a 2-day event, June 9th and 10th. My colleague Tamo Nakahara is a magician. She runs our DX program. She is a magician when it comes to putting on events like this. We will have a live DJ between sessions. It's going to be super fun. So please do come. But what gets me up in the morning is exactly, I'm going to use the anecdote that you talked about, Chris, earlier, as a specific example. I wake up every morning thinking, what is going to happen today that I just cannot even be anticipating that is going to have a lasting impact on my life? And there isn't something like that every day, but you had that day in 2018 when you showed up on the Newstack podcast. That was just another day. You woke up, you were going to be on a podcast, and the context of the conversation is what helped you make this really impactful statement that has had an impact on your life and other people's lives in the years since. Here it is 3 years later, and it's still such a moment of remembrance for you. And you recognize the rippling effects that that moment has had. That's what gets me up, because I believe that every day has a possibility of having one of those boulders in the pond that causes these huge rippling effects. And that's what I love about life.
Wow, what an amazing, I'm so glad that you were able to say that. An amazing finish to this episode. So thank you so much, Siamak. Thank you so much, Cornelia. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the efforts you're putting into the community at large for everyone out there trying to make their lives better in general, right? Like DevOps is essentially making lives better in my opinion. So, and using technology to do it. So thank you very much for coming on today, and really appreciate all the work you're doing out there. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Chris. Thanks for making this possible for us.
No problem at all. Coming up next, folks, is the one and only Sebi, and he will be talking about, he has a special guest talking about Quarkus today. So tune in. They're going to do some stuff with Doom, the video game. So that should be fun. So again, thank you, Cornelia and Siamak. Thank you, audience. And we will see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.